recently the Women's Rights Network put out a video which was popular about debunking some of the myths around women in sports. And this podcast aims to expand on some of those issues, what's currently going on in women's sports. So we've brought together some of the best minds from the Women's Rights Network who know a lot about what's going on. So let's find out who they are. Do you want to talk a little bit about yourself first, Corinne?
Hi, yeah, I'm Corinne. I live in West Yorkshire. I come from a great rugby league family. My granddad played professionally back in the 40s and 50s, and he was one of three brothers that did. So I've grown up with rugby league in my family through my childhood, and I started playing rugby back when I was a teen, but there was no women's sport, no women rugby where I live, so I had to play with the boys after a bit of a fight. So I've always been sporty, and then fast forward a couple of decades, I had some children and found myself, after bringing them up, that I was rather unfit, so I picked up a bicycle, and for the last 10 years I've been a cyclist, and I'm an ex-British cycling volunteer. I used to do lead rides for women, and I'm also a level 1 coach as well.
Okay, excellent. Cathy, tell us about you.
Yeah, okay. I've always been quite sporty, but not necessarily classic sports, so not your competitive team games. Although, to be fair, I was centre forward in hockey at school, now that I remember. But primarily, when I was younger, I did lots of gymnastics and trampoline, and then some rock climbing, so which suits gymnastics. So yeah, I did those kinds of sports, and so I qualified as a trampoline coach and a gymnastics coach, and then I went on, and just after university, I qualified as a windsurfing instructor. I got into water sports. Wow. So I've done quite a bit of coaching. We used to do every year, not for very many years, but it was a great week where we did a women's windsurfing week up on Coniston. And it was a residential week for women who wanted to have a go at windsurfing. So that was fab. And then I've worked in sport policy for 15 years, maybe. I was on the organising committee for the first International Women in Sport Conference. And that was in 1994 in Brighton. And I've worked for the National Coaching Foundation, which I think is now Sports Coach UK, and the National Federation of Women's Institutes. And anyway, fast forwarding, I eventually took up a job as an academic. So I worked as an academic in sport and physical activity department at the University of Cumbria for 23 years. And then just for the last 3 years, I've been an independent researcher, and I've been researching this very issue and published a couple of papers on it. And I'm just writing a chapter on it. So, yeah.
Fantastic. And we will be linking to a number of the papers that we mention in this podcast in the description. Thank you, Cathy. Tessa, tell us about you.
So I have loved sport my whole life. I grew up in a badminton playing family, but I'm very outdoorsy, cycled since I was, 3 or 4, I guess. When I was a kid, my parents didn't own a car, didn't have any money, and so we walked and cycled everywhere. So cycling was my main means of getting around, and I've since then cycled recreationally on road and off road. Love it. I'm currently a member of 3 cycling clubs and a welfare officer for one of them, because I have a strong interest in child and women's safeguarding as well. Okay. And I am a member of British Cycling too.
Fantastic. Well, great to have you all on. Thank you. Before we get into some of the really meaty issues, I think it helps to understand how we even got here. So, Corinne, can you give us a bit of a history of how is it that women's sport grew? How did it start? How did it grow?
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? What women's sport has always been a feminist issue, because it's been so tied to women's roles in society. And the reason why it's not as popular now as men's sport is because for many, many decades, women just weren't able to participate in sport. I think football in this country was probably the first organised sport to really hit women in a positive way, because women started playing football at the end of the 19th century and did pretty well, especially when World War I came along. Might not have been great for Europe, but great for women's football.
That was an upside.
Well, quite. It really liberated women. You know, they were given jobs in munition factories, but they also created entertainment outside of work. And at a time which I think in the country, you know, as we know from the last 2 years, when you can't do anything because of outside influences, life shrinks. So at one point, women's football matches were attracting 10,000 people, you know, to watch back in the 1920s. Now, I've read a couple of different views of this. If you read the FA's website, apparently they stopped allowing women's football teams to take part from 1921 onwards because women were constitutionally unfit to play football. But I read another account that says that it was a political decision. You know, men from seeing all the horrors of war. The women had their jobs while they've been away and taken their sport. And I've read one account, I don't know how accurate it is, I couldn't find it when I did a quick Google before this podcast, because I'd love to know if it was true. So they made a decision that it wouldn't have been good for men's welfare to come back from war after fighting for the country and to find their jobs and for sport taken over by women, so they banned them. And women weren't allowed to play football for decades. You know, it's utterly shocking, that, isn't it? You know.
And when did they start to get back into it then? Was it after the Second World War?
Yeah, but a long time afterwards. It was the late 60s. The FA finally allowed the Women's Football League to come together again, and I think 1971 was the first Women's Cup final.
Okay, and when I imagine the likes of the FA, I think of lots of blokes in grey suits, and I kind of have the same image in my head when it comes to the Olympics and decisions made by the IOC. So what about women in the Olympics? Has it been similar? It's taken a long time to really establish women's sport in the Olympics.
Yeah, I think the Olympics are doing better in participating of women than they are at boardroom level. They've still only got 20% of their board members are female. They've done better than football, the IOC. Women have always taken part, but on a much, much smaller scale. And even now, women are just not competing in the Olympics at the same level as men. They can't even take part in, you know, if you look at the length of cycling road races, the men's is much longer than the women's and things like that. It's still not an even playing field for women in the Olympics.
And it took a very long time, didn't it, for women to be included on an equal basis with men. So initially, at the beginning of the 20th century, very, very few women took part in the Olympics. And I always love this quote by Baron Pierre De Coubetin, who was the founder of the modern Olympics, where his attitude to women was, you know, bearing in mind he set up the modern Olympics, this feminine semi-Olympiad is impractical, uninteresting, ungainly, and improper. It is not in, he said, it's not in keeping with my concept of the Olympic Games, the solemn and periodic exaltation of male athleticism with the applause of women as a reward. So there you go.
Not much has changed. Not much has changed, has it really? I mean, if you think about the world of international cycling, where for many years, I mean, and obviously, you know, many of the events still don't have a female equivalent, like the Tour de France, but you know, for many years you just had sort of handmaidens handing out bouquets well men got their acclaim on the podium, and you know, that's not really changed that much. So yeah, you know, that's still seen, and you know, I think we shouldn't underestimate how deeply embedded that concept is of women just being, you know, the applauders and the cheerleaders and standing literally at the sidelines. You know, we're not allowed to actually participate for ourselves, for our own glory.
I just thought, Tessa, I was just thinking when you just said that, that's exactly it, isn't it? That's exactly what Pierre De Coubetin was saying, basically, the women are there to put the garlands around the men. And do they open the champagne, or can they not even do that?
We can't even do that, no, because that's quite a masculine thing to do. It's like a bit about arm strength. But I mean, on that, what you're saying about the same time as that quote. I mean, in 1897, women could study at Oxford and Cambridge, but they weren't awarded degrees. And so when a resolution was put to Cambridge University to allow women to actually receive the honours to which they were entitled, incidentally, some male students hung an effigy of a woman out of a window, and this woman was riding a bike. She was in cycling dress on a bike. Now that was not a coincidence, because men very well understood, these particularly unpleasant men very well understood that cycling is a symbol of liberation and independence. And when the resolution passed, they tore that effigy down and decapitated it. And ripped it to pieces and stuffed the pieces through the gates of Newnham College, which is Northern College.
Oh my Lord.
And I mean, so cycling has long been associated with, rightly, for women with liberation, freedom, independence, and sadly some people still sort of like that makes them feel very uncomfortable.
It's interesting. One more examples is that women are only allowed to take part in sport if the men will it.
It's at a male whim.
They are the gatekeepers to it.
Yeah, it's on a male whim. Yeah.
I've got a perfect example of that, because we talked about the history of women's sport, which was because women were only allowed in the Olympics in very limited numbers right through the 20th century, and in limited numbers of sports. They set up their own governing body, so it was called the Fédération Sportive Féminine Internationale, and they organised alternative Olympics in Paris, Gothenburg, Prague and London, so between 1922 and 1934. And what's interesting about that is those were so amazingly successful that the IAAF, which is the International Athletics Federation, basically thought, we need to step in and take charge of this. So basically the deal was that athletics events for women could only be included in the Olympics if the IAAF basically took over women's athletics.
How interesting.
So fascinating. And then this is amazing for British women. I only found this out just recently. So what happened was that they gave the women a really limited programme, a really limited athletics programme in the Olympics. And so the FSFI, the Fédération Sportive Féminine, made a fundamental compromise. And what they did was said, okay, to have the recognition of the IAAF will agree to a smaller number of events. But British women, supported by their male colleagues, protested at that and boycotted the Olympics because they said that's not enough events for us. So it's extraordinary, isn't it? The whole history of it all.
It's really fascinating. And again, it's what's really fascinating about that is that the current crisis that women's sport is facing, I think, has come about precisely because women's sport is now gaining in prestige, in investment, and in kudos. And so it's now become valuable property. And what happens with valuable property? Well, it usually gets colonized. And so that's why part of the reason why we are where we are, and it's a really grim reminder that women's sport only exists at male whim, whether that's the IOC or the UCI or something else. That we should stop kidding ourselves and taking it for granted that of course we're going to have women's sports and it's going to be equal. I mean, and bear in mind we're still struggling now to get decent sponsorship, equal prize money, all those things, careers, greater visibility and opportunities for women in coaching and management. And we're not just talking about athletes here. So we're still at an unequal stage, and even so, it's now being taken away from us.
Yeah. One other piece in the jigsaw, just very quickly, was there used to be separate governing bodies for male and female sport. In the UK and internationally, but the sports councils required a merger of those governing bodies between the 80s and 90s. And I remember this because I was working in sport at the time, sport policy at the time, And the argument, as far as I recall, although there is a published paper on it, was the sports councils only wanted to deal with one governing body. And as you were saying, Tessa, it would help women's sport. But actually what happened is those mergers became takeovers, and women lost their senior positions in coaching and admin and management, and effectively then lost control over their own sport because they'd merged with the male sport.
Well, don't you think, I mean, that's something we can maybe talk about later, is the time has come to actually have a women's governing body again, because we are not served by the current sports councils and national governing bodies. Who, to my mind, the more I've looked into this, seem to have a very troubling lack of accountability in general, given how much public money they receive, and how sports can actually be, as we all know, historically, sadly, quite an area for abuse and also inequality. And I think, you know, I've certainly come to the conclusion that actually other own governing bodies now.
Do you think that it's going to change with the publication of these Sports Council Equality Guidelines? Because those are absolutely spot on in terms of trans inclusion. So the previous Sport Council guidelines in 2013 were very much at elite level, testosterone suppression, at participation level, self-ID, whereas the new guidelines, which came out in 2021, are much more on the money. They're much more, I mean, they say very clearly, you can't have inclusion of trans athletes in female categories and fairness. So you have to choose one or the other.
But don't you think that's disastrous, Cathy? Because what I want them to do is to say exactly that. We've looked at the science. It's very obvious it's irreconcilable. Fantastic. Now, sports councils, I need you to direct sporting national governing bodies to understand that they must follow the Equality Act at the very least and preserve single-sex categories. Now, they didn't do that. They backed down, copped out, and said, oh, well, we recognise this now. So what each sport governing body is going to have to do is you're going to have to choose. And I just thought, well, that's just handing a mandate to national governing bodies to go, okay, then I'm going to choose transgender people then, which is unsurprisingly what they've gone and done. And this is outrageous, and it's very cowardly, but also it's not solving a problem in a practical and constructive way. And I can see an easy solution here, which is what they could have said, which is like, well, make the men's category an open category, and then in that category, by all means, have a subcategory to record transgender people if that's what transgender people want, but make the men's category open. So that way you get trans people in performing in sport, and including in sport in the way that they want to be included, which is in the gender of their choosing. You also make sure that women continue to be represented and don't lose any ground in terms of representation, because you keep the single sex category and you also recognise the science lying at the base of that. Now, why didn't they do that, do you reckon, Cathy?
I think because you've got a direction of travel, possibly, you know, and so, but I think my point that I make very strongly, and certainly the second academic paper I've published, is the Sports Council have to uphold the Equality Act because they are, you know, they're named in the Equality Act. They have a public sector equality duty to ensure no indirect discrimination against women. Ergo, if they are funding or investing in any governing body that discriminates against women, they are contravening the Equality Act. So I think, given the guidelines that the Sports Council Equality Group have produced, where they say very clearly you can't have both, you can't have inclusion of trans women in female categories and claim it's fair, the next step for me is for the Sports Council to say, we have to uphold the Equality Act. So part of our, you know, suite of criteria for funding you is that you also have to uphold the Equality Act for the stuff we fund you for. Otherwise, we're not investing in you because we can't. We'd be breaking the act. We'd be contravening the act.
That would be really interesting if that's the way to go. And I love your optimism. I think being a member of British Cycling, which is a bit, you know, is an interesting experience if you're female. I think there's some way to go there, because I know that Sports England gave millions of pounds to British Cycling with the express KPI of increasing the uptake of females in cycling, not women, females. So this was absolutely express. And in British Cycling used that money, part of that money, to set up breeze rides, which actually permits any self-identifying man whatsoever. So any man, basically. And that KPI is not measured. It's not specific. If they count the numbers of people doing breeze rides, of course, they don't know of those numbers, which are male and which are female. So I think there is some way to go in terms of ensuring that national governing bodies actually follow through and holding those national governing bodies to account, because I see no accountability on the part of British Cycling. It doesn't have a public sector equality duty. You can't submit a freedom of information request. It is extraordinary given the influence that it has and the monopoly it has on competitive cycling in the UK, which, as we all know, is one of the most prestigious, successful sports for UK across the globe.
Yeah, totally get that. But what I'd say is there is no accountability of British Cycling, but there is of the Sports Council of Sport England. And Sport England is the line of money to all the different sports in the country. So basically, as we said earlier on, the history of women's sport shows you're never going to get given anything on a plate, but it is up to us, people who are interested in pressure groups, grassroots women's groups, female athletes, and so on and so forth, to insist that the sports councils invest according to the law and that there is accountability for that money that goes to those governing bodies. That's the way to go with it, because British Cycling's not accountable, but the sports councils are, and they are accountable in their investment decisions.
Corinne, I think to say, sorry. To bring Corinne in.
I was just thinking that, throughout my life, I've done various grants applications and been successfully received grants. We set up a bike library and delivered women's cycling sessions. And every time you go for some grants, there's a really strict set of criteria that you have to follow, and then you have to report back on your outcomes. And it just seems to me incredible that Sport England and the other governing bodies are giving grants to national governing bodies like British Cycling to deliver, but they don't have firm and hard rules about how to use that money. I mean, British Cycling are treating women's cycling like it's a job done. Like there's 50% equal participation of men and women, when it's not. The woefully underrepresented. Cathy, I think in your last paper, I think it showed the difference between the two, and it was about 30% women to the rest. I'm not sure of the exact figures.
Funding,
So if British Cycling are now, with their new transgender policy that came out last weekend, saying that anybody can self-ID into grassroots and recreational sport, which is funded by public money, well, they really do need to be accountable for that. It is absolutely shocking that they're not.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Corinne, that I wanted to come back to, which I, as a welfare officer and cycling club member, I feel absolutely passionate about, which is that the Equality Act really only deals with competitive sport expressly. I know it also does deal with services, single-sex services, which I think can include exercise classes. But I think all of us care very much about entry-level sport. Because actually the vast majority of women and girls in this country are not going to be elite athletes, and they may not even want to do competitive sport. For a lot of people, that just is a massive turn off. But we all want girls and women to enjoy the enormous life-enhancing benefits, but for mind, body and soul of sport. And it doesn't have to be competitive, and that's not expressly protected in law. And I think that's a huge loophole. And it's surprising, really, when you consider that the government is so keen to prevent obesity, and we have, one generally reads about sort of mental health care crisis, etc., so much of which can be aided by having an active life, but we know from research campaigns like This Girl Can, and undertaken by Sports England, but that we have data on what puts girls and women off sport, and so we know that having single-sex spaces is one of the things that attracts girls and women. And also if we're thinking about equality and diversity and inclusivity, and we need to think about all those three things. Not having single-sex spaces is directly discriminatory against women of faith who can't socialise with males. Not to mention the fact that the 1 in 6 women in this country have experienced sexual domestic violence, and many of those will have PTSD and will not be looking for opportunities, to participate unless they have single sex opportunities. So it's extraordinary to me that there isn't more accountability, and there isn't more. There aren't greater moves to ensure that those spaces are available in sport.
How do we hold them accountable? What do we do?
Well, in my view, there are mechanisms for them to be accountable in the Equality Act, because, I mean, as you absolutely say, Tessa, the Equality Act, Section 195 covers competitive activities. Any competitive activity where there's basically a statistically significant difference between male and female performance. But as far as I'm concerned, that it doesn't say elite competitive activity, it says competitive activity. So I don't know about cycling, but in a lot of sports, competition is inherent to the sport. So in football, you can't play football if you're not being competitive, because that's the whole point of the game. So there's an argument to be had there about, the Act doesn't say we're talking elite sport. It says competitive activities. And I don't know how that tracks out in cycling, but I did do some number crunching on cycling, and obviously women are underrepresented. And I think if you divvy those stats up, when you look at competitive cycling versus recreational cycling that isn't in a competitive setting, if you like, not set up as I don't know, what's the cycling equivalent of a fun run? Sporting. Yeah, sporting, so something like, so if that's competitive, it's competitive, isn't it? And so I think that's one line of thinking. But the other line of thinking is also in the Equality Act, you can provide women-only activities if they are a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And so if in cycling women are underrepresented, which they are, then it is a legitimate aim to have female-only cycling. So I think those are two lines in which the law does support having women-only cycling. But I think it would have to be evidenced. And the other thing is sadly, as we've seen with a lot of other areas of women's rights, quite often it's going to have to go to court.
Yeah, well, I was about to say the problem is it's not mandatory, so it's optional, and because so many of these national governing bodies are disinclined, they just don't value women's sports, and if there's some money in it, it's kind of tolerated, and if there's some funding they can get, then okay, but it's not taken seriously, it's not valued, then unless they are actually required to do it, to evidence it as a KPI in return for getting funding, or actually mandate, required to have single sex spaces, they won't. And the problem with taking them to court, which I would really like to do, because I agree with you. I mean, as a solicitor, unfortunately, in my experience, power isn't given away voluntarily, and people don't change unless there's a real cost to them in terms of reputation or money. But because we're volunteers or we're just members of a sports body, we're not employees. We don't have the rights of employees, and so they can pretty much do what they like, really. We don't really have I don't think we have much means of forcing them to make those spaces, or I should say preserve those spaces, because they did used to have those spaces and they don't anymore.
They do. They are involved in provision of goods and services, though, aren't they? And that is with public money. So, I think there is a line there. We're talking about ways of holding them to an account. I was just going to go back to criteria for dishing out money from the sports councils. The sports councils do have criteria. They have criteria for dishing out money. There's absolutely no reason why they can't have, as part of their suite of criteria, that they need to uphold the sports council's duties as party to the Equality Act, because those duties can't be outsourced. So I think exactly as you say, Tessa, there's all this work gets done by women volunteers, which is outrageous. You've got all these, very well paid, organisations which are supposed to be advocating for women or for sports, and it's left to women in their own spare time to do all this work and crowdfund to take people to court. So hard work.
Lack of leadership from Sport England, isn't it? That they're not being clear when they give these funding, to fund something like Breeze, or This Girl Can. it's shocking that they're not leading on this. It's like with the, like you said before about the equality guidance, they're still sitting on the fence a little bit. They're still giving individual bodies the option to go for inclusion of men in women's sport or fairness and safety of women. It's like one or the other, rather than just going, no, we value women more.
Yeah.
Men have the option of competing or taking part elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it's just a shocking lack of leadership.
It would be really nice to be valued, wouldn't it? It would be really nice for Sports England to say, yeah, we actually really value women's fairness, and we really still acknowledge the fact that women are massively underrepresented in sport, and so we recognise that the work is not even halfway done, and so we really want to carry on with that and ensure women's greater visibility and careers and podium places in sport, but they haven't done that. But as I say, I honestly don't see this as an either or thing either. I just think you can make the men's category open. It's fine, so if people want to, I personally don't think it's got any relevance to sport, but if people want to enter a sport in the gender they're choosing and then make the men's category open, they can do that whilst preserving the integrity of women's sport, and that's your solution. So it's a real shame they weren't more express about that.
Well, I think what's quite interesting as well about that is when you look at, if you do look at elite level sport and you look at the swimming route that's gone on with Leah Thomas, you have trans men competing in the women's category. So Isaac Hennig competed in the women's category because obviously trans men, if they move across to the male category, are not competitive, because even on testosterone, you are not competitive against men. You can't make good the fact that you've gone through female puberty. So what's interesting to me is it doesn't seem to be an issue for trans men to compete in female categories, and yet it's an issue for trans women to compete in categories according to sex, male categories. So to me, that's a double standard, because
of course it is.
Males have two categories in which they can compete. They can compete in the male category, and if they're trans women, they can compete in the female category. Whereas women lose the one category that is designed to include them. It's basically about who holds the power, isn't it?
It's all about who has power, and it's a travesty. It's a travesty of fairness, and it's a travesty of sports, because men's sports continues completely unaffected by this whole extraordinary debacle, whereas, as you say, women's sports becomes the box into which you put anybody who isn't a masculine male, basically. So you have trans men, you have trans women, and you have women, and that's what our sport has become, is the box in which everyone else goes. And as you say, if it's not a problem for trans men, then to compete in the category of their sex, why is it a problem for trans women? And it's a really good point, Cathy, really interesting point. We keep talking about, we keep centering trans people in this debate, but actually, let's all be honest here, it's not. Trans men don't feature in this debate at all. I haven't even heard a trans men speak about this at all. And hey, trans men are female, aren't they? Right? So isn't it interesting? They don't seem to have a voice in this at all.
Totally.
So yeah. This isn't about trans people at all. This is about males. This is about male power, male privilege, and males colonizing valuable land, which is female sport, and that's what this is all about. Yeah. And I really wish people would be very clear about their language and talk about male and female, because this isn't actually about transgender.
One of the first places that women become socialized to certain ways of speaking and behaving and understanding the world is as girls in school. And that's also one of the first places that they'll play sport, or perhaps the only place they have the opportunity to play sport. Is there any room to do anything in the schools?
Well, one of the problems in schools that I would say is PE has been, it's not really considered a proper subject in the curriculum, so it's outsourced. And in general, it's outsourced to unaccountable bodies like, football clubs who provide a football coach to deliver the curriculum. And that, in my mind, and in all the research, basically really disadvantages girls, because primarily who you've got delivering PE in schools is, your traditional competitive team sports. which are not in general the sports that girls want to do. So, and I think the latest, well, not the latest, it was done a while ago now, but the most recent Ofsted inspection of schools, which looked at provision, said basically all the things that girls want to do get squeezed out of the curriculum. And that is primarily things like dance, gymnastics, trampoline, all those kinds of activities, get really squeezed. Competitive team sports take up the lion's share of the curriculum. In primary school teachers don't feel qualified to do PE classes because they've had, I think when I was at Cumbria, they had maybe 12 hours of PE in their primary training. So to cover all the activities they've got to cover. So although the PE curriculum is absolutely great if you teach it, because it covers a wide range of activities, effectively, competitive team sport is so cheap to do because you can outsource it to somebody who you can pay less than a teacher, i.e. a coach, and by the hour. And Bob's your uncle. My daughter, who's 17, has never done anything other than walk around the park, I think, in her school. That's PE. Walking is PE, you know. I mean, it's shocking compared to what I did when I was at school.
It is a real crisis. And I think, you know, as a parent as well, and having observed, you know, school sports and taken my kids to sporting events and regular sports, what I've observed is that the girls in particular, what it comes down to is, do you have a sporty parent who encourages you? And many of whom are fantastic dads, by the way. But, you know, if you don't have that parent who encourages you and believes in you and can afford to pay for you and can make the time for you, and let's remember that many parents can't do that because they're too busy working to put food on the table, then you are on your own, basically. And I mean, I was on my own actually, but because my parents were not particularly supporting, were working really hard. But luckily, I mean, I grew up in the 70s and was outside an awful lot, but I didn't have any opportunities, you know, because there weren't any for girls. There was no football. There just wasn't a lot. And so I think girls are massively underserved in schools, and it's a lottery.
I think this what you two have just discussed there feeds back into the fact that women didn't have sport for so long, because my youngest daughter plays football. She's 15, and all the coaches are men, all the dads, because none of the mums played, you know, because they weren't, you know, when so if your mums are similar to my age, when they were at school, they probably played netball and hockey, maybe rounders in the summer. So nobody has that grounding, so you don't have that stream of people who had played a certain sport and then they grew up and then maybe would turn to volunteering in the sport that you've got in the boys' game. And
we don't have that culture. We don't have a history, and we don't have a culture. And people who sneer at women's sport, particularly women's football, and say, "Oh, well, it's not as good as men." It's a different game. It's a different game because we're female. We're not small men. We're not men with less testosterone. We're women. But also, we don't. You know, give us a chance. We are coming up from grassroots level with absolutely zero support, and we are building our culture and our history from the ground up. So, and we've got some fantastic teams now. We've got girls. You know, your children and other people, so the new generation are building it, but it's really young. It's easy to forget just how young women's sport and women's professional sports, and now it's being taken over when we've barely even got up and running. You know, it's
I mean, it's even you know, the female teachers, PE teachers at the high school don't teach football and rugby. The men do. And this is I mean, we've sort of skirted over a few of the barriers of participation a bit, but this is classic a barrier of participation. So my daughter decided that she was going to try it for the rugby team at school. And they weren't really organised in the same way that the boys are. You know, the boys have got very clear, weekly training sessions, weekly matches, and it was all a bit cobbled together. So she turned up for the first session of training. She never played the game in her life. And the male PE teacher at the end of it said, "Right, you're playing on Friday," and she went, "No, I've never played this before. You know, I've only come up for training today." No, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. I'll put you in the team. See you Friday. Well, she turned up to the car in tears because I mean,
it's very intimidating.
The boys, I've no idea, but that ain't going to work for girls. You know, she never went back again. And if he'd have thought about it, if he'd have put a system in place to get girls confident in the basic skills, and then say to them, look, we've done 6 weeks of work on this, let's have a little match, and introduce them that way, he might have got girls sucked into that sport for life. But because of that man's attitude, it's lost them. And you see that again, time, because you haven't got female coaches who don't understand the psyche. They'll lose them young.
Well, a lot of sport is about fitting into the man box, and cycling is absolutely classic with that. It's like, well, we'll grudgingly allow women in this sport if they fit into the existing box of the existing norms. And if you're, you know, tough enough to do that, there's an awful lot of sort of macho bullshit in cycling, excuse my language. But, you know, if you're the sort of woman who goes, yeah, to do that, like a challenge, one of the lads, I have to do that, be fine. If you're not, you don't pass that test, and then it's not for you, you know. And when I was briefly a women's officer a volunteer women's officer for British Cycling on one of their committees, was very much the focus was, how do we get more women into racing? And I just think, well, yeah, that's definitely one very laudable aim, but actually I just want to get women into cycling, and you know, why are we not looking at that, at the broader picture of that? Because maybe a lot of women don't actually want to get into road racing. It's really interesting that cyclocross, by the way, has exploded in popularity for men and women, but particularly for women, and I'm really thrilled about that. It's incredibly exciting, dynamic sport. Zoe Baxted has just won the World Championship, Cyclocross Junior Championships. Fantastic, Zoe. Let's hope that you have a career that's not taken away from you by self-identifying man, but we'll come back to that later. But you know, it's women do want to do these sports, but you're quite right, Corinne, they need to not be shoved into the man box. You know, there needs to be some more imaginative thinking here about, you know, as I say, we're socially conditioned from birth very differently. You know, we're all individuals, and you know, how can we encourage girls and women into sport?
Yeah, I've done that when I was women's officer in a mixed sex cycling club. We had 11 female members and 77 men, and a lot of those female members were actually mums.
Yeah, Kelsey Breeze. Yeah,
but it was all about the racing, and they were saying we need to put some women's races on. I said, yes, you do, but you need to do something first. So we put together. I got some coaches, said do a 6-week training block, a women's introductory race training session for 6 weeks, and at the end you've got a race. Open it to everybody else, because they're very sort of cliquey, the clubs. They don't like everybody else going. Open it to everybody, regardless of the club. Weird women coming. You know, but with the men, they'll put on a race and blokes turn up. You know, it's a completely different way of thinking. Even if they've never raced before, they're like, yeah, I've got a bike, I'll turn up. I admire that.
There's no shame, there's no judgment. And I mean, they're really hard on themselves, guys, but they're much more sort of, well, I didn't have to justify myself to anybody, I'm just going to show up. Whereas I think women are constantly you know, put under pressure to somehow sort of be worthy and justify ourselves, you know, for taking up this public space, and it's incredibly, do not underestimate the toll it takes. I know I've spoken to women who've done racing for the first time, amateurs, and it's really it's really tough, and you know, massive kudos to them, really. So yeah, we had to think about that. I mean, I should say British Cycling has done some beginners to racing coaching with a fantastic guy, a fantastic male coach who I cannot praise highly enough in the West Midlands, who was just so great with coaching women and really got a diverse group together. I joined that group, and it was just a really successful group, and I got women in, and there are, you know, women's time trials are really popular in my areas as well, really fantastic. And that again is a fantastic way to get women into the sport, because you're racing yourself. You're not actually, and you're not going to get taken out by a peloton. You know, you've set off on your own and you race your own time, and that's a great option. But we need to be imaginative, and we need to not expect women to fit into the existing boxes of traditional sports categories. It's not fair, it's not reasonable, and it's certainly not going to increase the uptake of women in sport.
Well, I think in addition to that, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's the whole culture, because the whole culture of male sports is very masculine in terms of gender stereotypes. And that may be, you know, one of the reasons why we've got problems you know, with males with a whole different, you know, spectrum of presentation in terms of gender identity, wanting essentially a kind of flight from toxic masculinity.
That's
and if we didn't have those very, very, you know, masculine, male, aggressive kind of environments in male sport, that would be more welcoming for a whole range of different males who present in different ways. And one of the things I think is, why can we not look at the Fafafine, probably pronounced that really wrong, but anyway, but it's an umbrella term in Samoa for people who identify as gay men, trans women, non-binary, people with female characteristics, but all of who are male. And they compete very happily and play very happily in male sport. So one of the things I think is maybe an issue in this country is, you know, I know it's a cliche, but the toxic masculinity of male sport culture. And instead of women having to solve that by having everybody in the female category, maybe that's something for males to solve in the male category and in male sports. You know, the whole thing about having a look at why is it so, you know, in some scenarios so homophobic, why are there so few out gay male footballers, and so on and so forth. So it's not just a problem in terms of where do trans women, aka males, compete. It's a problem in terms of where males who don't fit that, you know, gender stereotype belong in sport. So I think male sport has got a lot of work to do on that front.
That is such a great thing to say. Yeah, totally support that.
Lesbians have always been prominent and welcome in women's sport ever since I played. Well, back in the early 90s, I did play rugby in a women's team eventually when I got old enough, and it must have been a 50-50 split between straight women and gay women. And they've always been welcome. It is men's sport that is not welcoming to gay men. Women's sport generally does not have an issue with people's sexualities. No. And it's really not, it does bother me when you see Stonewall, you know, saying, oh, it's terrible, the sport's such an unwelcoming place for LGBT people. Well, actually, no, it's men's sport, that is. It's not.
It's a really
good,
really good point.
Who they are.
Yeah, actually, because, I totally agree with you.
And but one of the reasons for that is the whole thing about, you know, sport reinforces stereotypical masculinity, but challenges stereotypical femininity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So actually, sport is a really good place, you know, for lesbians to be, because they don't have to conform if they don't want to. Not that everybody should have to, but people don't have to conform necessarily in sport. Or there's that, you know, there's that sense of, you know, it transgresses some types of femininities, doesn't it? Because, you know, by definition, you have to be strong, you have to be powerful, you know, in elite sport, not necessarily in recreational sport.
And you have to be selfish.
Yeah.
Which women is, you know, that's the biggest crime you can commit as women. You know, if you're a dedicated athlete, you have to be really like yourself first and stand for yourself. And that's a very taboo thing for a lot of people.
So I think lesbian women have always felt at home in female sport, but the opposite in male sport for gay men.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you. And again, my experience of British cycling, when I can only speak as women, so I'm not speaking for any men, but I think, you know, what I've observed about British cycling, and it's partly the nature of cycling itself, and the competitive elite cycling, it's the most traditionally macho, not just masculine, but really macho environment. And that's got to be a very uncomfortable place to be for a lot of men. You know, not just women, and particularly young men who gentle men, very sporty guys, but you know, not conventionally masculine men, must find that I think really a really difficult, alienating place to be, and that must be very confusing. And I agree with you. You know what? Women's sport is not a refuge and a remedy for male fragility, and it's not a remedy for masculinity, this kind of macho masculinity, and that's work for men's sport to do.
So for those people who are listening to this podcast, who are interested in sport, interested in women's rights, interested in equality, what can they go away and do to make things better?
Challenge the national bodies. It's the only way. If your sport has chocking policies that are anti-women, challenge them. It's the only way we can stop this. You know, in the Women's Rights Network, we've been approached recently by somebody who plays touch rugby, which should be a really welcoming sport for everybody, because women can play it, men can play it, they can play it together. And their policy basically makes every single category mixed sex. So if you feel strongly that, you know, for our daughters, for the women that are going to come behind us, challenge them.
But also, you're not alone. So listen, I work full time. I've got 2 kids. I'm really tired. I'm going through the perimenopause, and I have a hobby. So, you know, I'm pretty knackered, basically. So I do this in my spare time. And you are not alone. So please contact the Women's Rights Network. We have a sports division, and we're all in this together. There's a lot of solidarity. I know that, you know, it's hard to challenge. You can feel very exposed. You can feel very judged. You can think, I don't even know where to start. That's fine. You know what? We can help you. We can support you. And I think, you know, please contact us, because if nothing else, you'll have a really good time, because we're all good company. But also you pool resources, and that's what women have always done, you know, and that's what we're doing now. So please, get in contact.
To get in contact with the Women's Rights Network, you'll find us on Twitter at Women's Rights Net, and our website, womensrights.network. See you there.